Good evening. Welcome back to Montreal Now. Dan Delmar and Sarah DeHay in for Aaron and Natasha. Obviously, real estate top of mind, as we've been discussing earlier in the show, and pretty much for every millennial and certainly a lot more Canadians who are having trouble affording their homes on a month-by-month basis. And you report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives paints a really stark portrait, Sarah, of just how tough it is to afford rent city by city across the country. Joining us is David MacDonald, Senior Economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Mr. MacDonald, hello.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. A pretty scary report, I would say, and the highlight basically is that we're kind of in the throes of a crisis. The warnings are over, and now people simply cannot afford their rent versus their income at this point in Canada's major cities.
That's right. And so what this report looked at was it calculated how much you would have to make on an hourly basis to afford a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment in Canada's big cities compared to the minimum wages in those provinces. And so what we find is that irrespective of the province, the 1 or 2 bedroom rental wage, is what we're calling it, is well above the minimum wage. So if we take a look, for instance, at Montreal, the minimum wage was $14.25 in October, where this data is from. But to rent a 1-bedroom apartment, you'd have to make $18 an hour, or to rent a 2-bedroom apartment, you'd have to make $20 an hour for it to be affordable. And so this is, several dollars an hour more than the minimum wage, which means if you're making minimum wage, you're going to have a tough time finding an apartment, even though Montreal and most of the Quebec cities actually are on the affordable end of this range.
Cold comfort, David. We often hear from folks who say, well, people who work minimum wage, may live at home with their parents. They're too young to actually live on their own and they're students. So why would we need to pay them more money? What's your rebuttal to that?
Some of them are. Yeah, some of them absolutely are. But a lot of them are just regular folks living alone. Some of them are single parents. Think of trying to rent a 2-bedroom apartment on minimum wage. It's going to be pretty difficult. And so one of the ways to sort of look at it, too, is how the situation has changed over the last 4 years. So we actually did something quite similar 4 years ago. And so in the case of Montreal, despite the fact that minimum wages have gone up a little bit in Quebec since 2018, it actually takes 4 extra hours of work at minimum wage now than it did in 2018 to afford the average 2-bedroom apartment. Now, as I said before, the cities in Quebec are slightly more affordable. And if you look below the city level in Montreal, there does exist neighborhoods where you can afford the average 1-bedroom apartment at minimum wage. 17% of the neighborhoods in Montreal, you can afford a 1-bedroom apartment at minimum wage, and 2% of the neighborhoods you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment at minimum wage. That's not a lot, but that's actually really good compared to the rest of the country. Of the 37 cities that we looked at, there's only 10 where there's even a single neighborhood that's affordable for a minimum wage worker trying to get a 1-bedroom apartment.
What is the best way, in your view, to alleviate the stress that so many low-income Canadians or even middle-class Canadians are experiencing? Is it to quickly raise the minimum wage, or is it to quickly make sure that local governments, especially here in Montreal, are building more housing?
Yeah, I mean, we often, when we talk about housing affordability, we often get into this really simplistic answer of saying, oh, well, it's a lack of supply and that's the problem. But I think there's a lot more to it than that. Certainly when we think about rental affordability in particular, we have to think outside of supply. We have to think about things like rent controls and how adequate they are. So, Quebec has rent controls. So we have to make sure that not only are they in place, but the loopholes that allow landlords to increase rent by more than inflation say, that we make sure that those are very limited. It is important to talk about wages here. The other big provinces already have $15 an hour minimum wage. This is Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta. And they have for a year or two now. Quebec is sort of behind on that front. And that is another way to make things more affordable is to raise that minimum wage. And so you pull up folks at or near that minimum. And so, it makes rent potentially slightly more affordable. When we do talk about supply, supply matters, but the type of supply matters just as much as just having any old new supply. So if you want to, pave farm fields and put up mansions, that is going to increase supply, but it's not going to do anything for rental affordability. For rental affordability, you need purpose-built rental. You need it to be at non-market rents, so rents that can be affordable, not whatever the market will bear. And ideally, you would be more centrally located, so folks don't have to drive into the city in order to get to work. Historically, the federal government has played a big role here in building affordable housing, certainly in the 70s and 80s. That really fell off at the start of the 1990s. And the feds have been out of the game for 30 years. That has restarted to some degree with the National Housing Strategy that sort of started up again in 2017. A lot of it's actually premised on private sector development. And the trouble with high interest rates is not only do high interest rates drive up rents, but they also decrease the interest of private developers in building more housing generally. And so that could have an impact here. What that probably means is the feds need to play a more direct role in building more affordable housing in a high interest rate environment like we have today.
David MacDonald is an economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I want to circle back to what you said there, that the feds were very involved with creating housing for a certain period of time there. Then it dropped off, I guess, in the 80s, 90s. Why did that happen?
Yeah, it was late 1980s, early 1990s. It was initially under the Mulroney government, and then under the following, the Martin government after that. And so the idea, at least in part, was, well, first of all, they just didn't want to spend the money, so that was part of the equation. The idea, in part, was that some of this money would go to the provinces, and the provinces would take up the mantle of affordable housing from the federal government. And that happened for a couple of years in some provinces, notably Quebec. And then that fell off as well. And so then no one was doing it. And in that period in the 70s and 80s, there were years where half of all new rental units that were being built were affordable units paid for by CMHC. And so it just goes to show the difference then compared to, after the mid-1990s and forward to almost today, where you have almost no federal involvement of CMHC in building new affordable housing. We know CMHC now as, reducing the cost for homeowners when they seek mortgages. It used to play also a big role in reducing the cost for renters, but it hasn't done that in a long time.
Just on the personal note to end, David, what are some of the basics that people should know about how much of their income is supposed to go to rent? What is in the range of acceptability, and when does it get to be too much for anyone to bear?
The threshold that we use in this study is 30%. So 30% of your pre-tax income going to rent. Once you exceed that threshold, then it is considered unaffordable. And so you ideally would have it be under 30%. I mean, for folks making minimum wage, that's pretty unlikely. So it's pretty likely that they're over 30%. It's pretty likely that they're in an apartment that might be smaller than what they need. So, instead of simple one bedroom, maybe they're in a bachelor. If it's a single parent, instead of a two bedroom, maybe they're in a one bedroom. And one of the other concerning trends that's sort of going along with the increase in costs generally that we've seen over the last 2 years is a big uptick in food bank usage. Now you'd think, well, that's related to the price of food. In some degree it is, but it's also related to the increase in the cost of rent, because folks, if they are short of money, will pay rent first and then utilities, and then they'll pay for food. So if anything gets cut, it's often food. And so despite the fact that we have a strong labor market and a lot of these folks have jobs, they just don't have jobs that pay nearly enough to afford the rent. And so you lose out on food and you end up in a food bank, even though you're working.
David MacDonald, senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, with this sobering look at how rental rates are rising faster than we can afford them in our cities. David, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.